Again, my name is Stephen Gale. I'm the organizer of the Lines Symposium. I just want to thank you again for joining us for day 2. Day 1 was very nice. It was a great success. We appreciate everybody who came out for that too. So I would like to go and acknowledge 2 significant facts before we get today rolling. So just to keep in mind, this year, 2019, marks the 400-year anniversary of the first 19 Africans that were brought to Jamestown and documented, who were the first Africans brought to an English colony, documented on record. Also, African American History Month this year, the official theme is Black Migrations. So that emphasizes the movement of people of African descent to new destinations and subsequently to new social realities. Dividing Lines is about researching, understanding, and preserving the stories that came with these migrations. So I would just like for you all to constantly reflect on that as we go through today. I definitely want to make sure we recognize the juxtaposition of African and Native American experiences, but also keeping in mind the significance of the African experience at this time, due to the significance of this year specifically, as well as this year's theme for Black History Month. We have a pretty tight schedule today, so I just want to inform you that we have an informational table for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History up by the front near the elevator. We also have a table and display from author, genealogist, and cultural preservationist, Ms. Teresa Kemp. And so now we'll just move on to our first panel for this today, concerning history in the African and Native diasporas in the Americas, moderated by Dr. Seneca Vaught, KSU. And from there, we'll move over to Library 101. Space permitting, if we have any overflow throughout the day, we'll also have a live stream available up here. As we go on, after that, we'll be prompting you about what the next motions are for the day. So without any further ado, Dr. Seneca Vaught.
Okay, good morning, everyone. As you know, my name is Seneca Vaught, and I'm very excited to share a project with you that began in Peru with my co-collaborator, Ernesto Silva here. This brief presentation today that I'll share with you was not what I originally intended to share today. After I got on the phone with Ernesto earlier this week, he recommended, why don't you share what we've been working on in Peru for the last year. And I said, okay, that's a good plan. So these are just outlined here are some general concepts of a project that we're working on called Tupac by Tupac. And it really explores or engages these overlapping, intertwined lives of Tupac Amaru II and Tupac Shakur, one leader of resistance in Peru, and the other leader of rebellion, popularly characterized in hip-hop culture in the United States, Afro-American culture. I'm going to try to find a way to move this keyboard so I can find it. So I will keep my presentation around 10 minutes so that we have ample time for our other presenters today. And it's hard to moderate myself, but I'll try without asking Ernesto to help. So on May 18, 1781, Tupac Amaru was forced to watch his wife, Michaela Bastidas, a woman of indigenous and African lineage, his son, Hipólito, and many of his followers killed in the plaza of Cusco. After a failed attempt to draw him with 4 horses, Tupac was quartered while he was still alive and then beheaded in the same location where his alleged great-great-grandfather, Tupac Amaru, suffered the same fate for an insurrection some 200 years earlier. Tupac Amaru met his demise, but also Tupac Shakur, who you see pictured in a motion picture to the left, met a similar and under different circumstances in September of 1966. He faced a hail of bullets a second time. Now, these final moments of both men, popularized in film here, are represented, I think, in dissonant frames that illustrate how seemingly unconnected the lives of Tupac Amaru II and Tupac Shakur are. The drawing and quartering of one and the drive-by shooting that ended the life of another were deeply politicized killings that convey significant messages and symbols about indigenous resistance in the Andes and its parallels in the globalization of Black hip-hop culture. Yet these two tragic ends that tie both of these Tupacs together in death during the prime of their lives also hint us to consider concerns among scholars, urge us to consider concerns among scholars who are wary of ill-attempted comparisons between these two men. So we entitled this presentation, Tupac by Tupac, to underscore the multiple intersection in the lives and legacies of these two men, who seemingly would have very little in common. Tupac Amaru was a cacique of Quechua-speaking populations, and Tungasuka and Pampamarca governing on behalf of Spanish governors before leading a rebellion against them in 1780. Tupac Shakur was the son of a Black Panther and aspiring dancer before transforming his poetic gifts into hip-hop leadership, blurring the lines between thug life and political resistance. Yet both these two men centuries apart and under vastly different circumstances were ironically joined together by more than their name, but the spirit of resistance and striving against the forces that threatened their people. These ideas that Dr. Silva and I explore in this paper have been explored in previous work by Charles Walker, a recent book on the Tupac Amaru Rebellion, as well as Che Fanon Wilkins, and From Tupac to Tupac, from Toussaint rather to Tupac, and many others. And many of these works engage to varying degrees the legacy of the Tupacs, but they fall short of addressing a particular problem. And that problem revolves around the global symbolism of Tupac in name and in aesthetics. Both Tupacs are perceived as being connected in name only, somewhat serendipitously, but having very little other value as a frame of analysis. So our question is, where is Tupac Amaru in the Black Atlantic, and where is Tupac Shakur in the Andes? So in this research, we argue that the lives and legacies of both Tupacs are intertwined like two shining serpents, reflecting the past and present, indigenous and Afro-diasporic ways of naming, knowing, and resisting. The indigenous memories of resistance are largely unknown to global audiences, but the spirit of these movements resonate in an imaginary continuum. We can better understand how these lives are intertwined when we examine the names of Tupac Amaru and Tupac Shakur and how they invoke bad man mythoforms as responses to racism and colonialism. In addition to, quote unquote, kicking ass and taking names, we know that the iconography of both men, Tupac by Tupac, contributed to a multiplier effect that escalated in the years following their deaths. We intersperse the drawings of Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, a chronicler of the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Guaman Poma provided startling images that chronicled Spanish abuses of indigenous populations that both preface Tupac Amaru II as well as Tupac Shakur. But these drawings underscore the enduring iconography and symbolism of indigenous protest. and Afro-diasporic relations to it. Comparatively exploring the naming, the mythoforms, and the intertwined symbolism, we argue, that we can better understand the legacies of both men. So very quickly, there's 3 parts to this essay. We'll only roughly deal with 2 today. The first part deals with this question of naming. Tupac Amaru was named, the second was named after Tupac the first, and the decision to take on that name was to assume a history of revolution, resistance, as well as persecution. His forebearer was captured and tragically killed as a result of attempting to establish a Neo-Incan kingdom. But also, this name that he assumed evokes a sense of community, a sense of rebellion to generations that followed. We find similar evidence among Tupac Shakur, whose mother, Afeni Shakur, who was a Black Panther, and Tupac, who was the son of her and another Black Panther, specifically chose this name because of the feelings, the sentiments that it evoked. We've come across some research to suggest that this name choice was just a flippant decision, but we argue that the very act of naming, particularly in the African American context, and specifically to choose an indigenous name from that, specifically a leader of a rebellion, carries within itself a political act of resistance. From my own perspective, I give my name as an example. My name is Seneca, which my colleague does. It's quite a popular name in upstate New York, where there are a large population of indigenous inhabitants of that region, the Seneca, who are quite influential in times past and to the present. But most people, when they come in contact with me, assume that the name Seneca is a Roman name, of the Roman philosopher. So it kind of can carry meanings in both contexts. When I lived in New York, it resonated in a certain way with indigenous populations there, but in the South it means something different. Similarly, the name of Tupac meant multiple things to multiple audiences. As he reflected on the name himself, he evolved the name into more of a rebellious tone, drawing on cues from Tupac II, but then reinterpreting that interpretation to suit his own political, cultural, as well as aesthetic ends. The second part, in the interest of time, deals with this notion of iconography. Throughout, you'll see images or monuments to Tupac Amaru II throughout Peru, as well as images and iconography associated with Tupac Shakur, both in the United States, obviously, but also throughout the African diaspora. There is new research that has actually examined the name Tupac Shakur in Bolivia, where there was also indigenous revolt connected to Tupac Amaru II. And recent hip-hop performers in Bolivia have created a song called Huayna Rap that draws on the legacy of both Tupac Shakur as well as Tupac Amaru. There's also components of this within the political regimes within Peru and the Velasco regime that came to power in the late 1960s through the 1970s. They drew on the image and the memory of Tupac Amaru to articulate specific changes within the government. And an understudied aspect of those changes was that government's relationship to Afro-Peruvian populations and some of the land reforms that were associated with that. Of course, we're all familiar with the face of Che Guevara, pictured there, and that famous photograph taken by Cora. But the image of Che Guevara kind of takes on a life of its own long after he was killed. So we see him on, certainly featured on money, but also as an emergent icon within hip-hop itself. And some have criticized Jay-Z for being the very epitome of capitalism in hip-hop for rocking Che Guevara, with gold chains bumping against Che Guevara's head rather, through his performances. nonetheless, that the very icon itself, I think the lowest common denominator, evokes somewhat of a message of rebellion and resistance that is global in its nature. And certainly the name, as well as the imagery of both Tupacs, here we see how Tupac emerges as an icon, you know, which some scholars have argued, when you can reduce an image to the most minimal of lines, it has achieved iconographic status, with the bandana and, you know, the cross and the tattoos serving to represent Tupac across a variety of global audiences. It means the same thing, a resistance to the status quo, a resistance to power. One of the interesting aspects of this is examining some of these drawings of Wyman Poma and how he was writing before both Tupacs, before Tupac Amaru in the 1500s, but using his chronicling and the images associated with his chronicling to critique Spanish colonial rule. And he does so very skillfully by talking between the lines, so to speak. I find this particular image indicative of much of our argument that we're making about these two Tupacs, and that it's an image that shows a royal administrator flogging an African slave for the Indian failing to collect the proper tribute, which was 2 eggs. It falls short. So this drawing is included twice in this chronicle, which suggests that it was an instance that was very deeply etched in the memory of the people there. But I think the way that we can read it, we can interpret it in 2 ways. One way that we can interpret it is we can look at it as Afro descendants in Peru and indigenous populations in Peru being at odds with one another, kind of with the Afro populations being used by the Spanish to execute punishment. But we can also read it through another lens as being interpreting both communities as being somewhat victims of colonial administration and hegemony, and as lightly veiled appeals, rather, to attack or to resist colonial authority. The ways that people have built upon these lineages, so to speak, whether in name or in iconography, are complex and vary throughout the world. The monuments to Tupac Amaru II throughout Peru are also complemented by monuments to Tupac Shakur in the United States, and the one on the right appears in Germany. So both of these men have achieved global popularity, cult status, so to speak, for the messages and the imagery that is associated with their resistance. So this brings me to our final points. When dealing with an iconography of this status and the afterlives of both Tupac Amaru II as well as Tupac Shakur, in many ways the appropriation of this imagery and what it stood for in times past comes into a bit of a challenge in the moment as that imagery becomes appropriated by certain political actors, whether in the case of the Velasco regime or here in the case of Marco Rubio, a self-proclaimed hip-hop aficionado. So in the mouth of other actors, so to speak, these revolutionary or resistance-oriented forms of, for lack of a better term, imagery of hip-hop and the name of Tupac Amaru take on different meanings that in some ways are more detrimental to the legacy of these two men than the actual physical deaths that were suffered by both of them. So this will be my last slide before I relinquish the remaining time to my two co-panelists. But there's a beautiful and very disturbing painting of the tragic end of Tupac Amaru II. And that image serves as a rallying point for his memory, as well as a political point for continuing generations, to say subsequent generations, to challenge the status quo. Similarly, within the context of hip-hop, the shooting of Tupac Shakur by Southside Crips in in the 1990s serves as a rallying point and a reinterpretation for resistance against other authorities. Even in Sierra Leone, where Tupac Shakur is also regarded highly, his image and his death serves as a resurrection, so to speak, in terms of other protests and a second life long after he is gone. So in conclusion, we hope that examining both forms or both reincarnations of these men and their legacies helps us to intersect global struggles across diverse boundaries to challenge not only this Black international diaspora to incorporate more indigenous critiques of power, but also to challenge indigenous diasporas to incorporate some of what is largely perceived as distinct boundaries between these two communities. We think there's much more overlap than is suggested in the current historical as well as theoretical work. So this is the beginning, we hope, of a project that will explore at least one aspect of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. Up next, we have Dr. Gary Van Valen from the University of West Georgia presenting, and follow that we'll have Professor Scott Moss, and then Dr. Vaught will then open up the floor for questions and field them there.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for being here. I lost my voice earlier this week while I was teaching, so I hope it'll last 10 minutes or so, but I'm glad there's a microphone here. Anyway, thank you for inviting me here and to be part of this panel. I'm a historian of Latin America. I work not too far away at the University of West Georgia. And I'm going to share with you the beginnings of a project, and what gets me interested in a historical topic usually is an individual that seems to be important and somehow has been neglected or been misinterpreted by people that have looked at this individual before. So this person that I'll tell you about, Don Simón Luna, was Afro-Argentine, but he lived among indigenous people. The Santiagueño Quechua, that's the Argentine way of saying Quechua, the same people that Tupac Amaru was from. So, Argentina, you may know, is widely considered to have the most European population among Latin American nations. It is true that large parts of the country were resettled by a wave of European immigration between 1870 and 1930. 3 million Europeans came to live permanently in Argentina and outnumbered the 2 million descendants of the colonial era population. But I'll look at a period before 1870, in the 1830s and 40s, when descendants of indigenous people and Africans formed a large percent of the population. Now here are the provinces of Argentina. I'm going to be looking at this particular province. The province of Santiago del Estero. St. James of the Swamp is what it means. And it's kind of a neglected corner of Argentina, one of the poorest provinces of Argentina. Nevertheless, its population has especially diverse origins. The capital city is also called Santiago del Estero. It's the oldest European city in Argentina, founded in 1553, and they call it the mother of cities even today. Nevertheless, its Spanish founders were outnumbered by indigenous people who came with them from Bolivia and Peru, who came as their allies or their servants. And these people brought the Quechua language, which is still spoken in the province of Santiago del Estero. And this other map shows Quechua Santiagueño occupying that particular province. So you look at that map and you would say, well, the majority of people there must be Indian or Native American or indigenous. Nevertheless, many people came to Santiago del Estero. By the 1700s, the province also received an influx of Africans. Late colonial period censuses note high African percentages in this province. In 1778, something over 50% of the people of the province were listed of African origin, and certain districts within the province had over 90% African origin people. So that was the situation in the late colonial period. A lot of African people, but a lot of people speaking an indigenous language, and a lot of mixture between peoples. Argentina gained de facto independence in